Welcome to another episode of the Your Longevity Blueprint podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Jill Carnahan, who's a board-certified integrative holistic medicine specialist known as your functional medicine expert and often referred to as the Sherlock Holmes of medicine for solving the case of the most well-known medical mysteries. Utilizing state-of-the-art lab testing and biochemical analyses, she helps each patient identify the root cause of their illness by identifying nutritional or metabolic imbalances that may be contributing to their symptoms. Dr. Jill uses nutritional protocols and supplements, lifestyle changes, and medication to increase patient level of function and always seeks the gentlest and least invasive ways to restore health and optimize healing. She has also sustained a 5+ year waiting list as the medical director of Flatiron Functional Medicine, a wildly sought after practice. As a survivor of breast cancer, Crohn's disease, and toxic mold illness, Dr. Jill brings a unique perspective to treating a variety of complex and chronic illnesses and has traveled the world sharing her knowledge of hope, health, and healing live on stage, as well as through newsletters, articles, books, podcasts, and social media. Her memoir, Unexpected, which I have right here, is out now, which is the highlight of our conversation today. So welcome to the show, Dr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm more excited than you. I told you I've looked up to you for a long time, so happy to have you on the show. And I did read your entire book. And for the listeners, I'll just give them a little intro to this. So it's a cross section between a personal memoir about trauma, healing, and recovery, and a self-help guide designed to give practical advice for those seeking solutions to long-term chronic illnesses. It explores the role faith and spirituality can play in one's healing journey, coming from a medical doctor who has diagnosed and treated countless patients suffering from life-altering disease and who has also suffered from great loss. And I'll tell you what, you had me at science and faith because early in your book, you talked about rock climbing and you said something, I might not get this right, but you said something like science and faith combined with experience form wisdom. And that line just spoke to me. It was just such an eloquent line. And I thought, this book's going to be good. She's speaking my language. And so I want to start there, actually. I want to start with this rock climbing moment and kind of what you learned that day. So take us back there.
Yeah, so the most profound moments in our life start very normally. I remember the alarm clock that day and it's like, okay, here we go. I'm going on a climb. Now,
had you climbed before?
No, that's
okay.
what I'd never even been in a rock climbing gym. So let me take it back 3 months prior. I was sitting in a coffee shop with my writing coach who helped me kind of outline the book and put together things. He's a rock climbing expert. So one conversation, we're talking about my life on the farm growing up, and he just like looks over me and says, "Hey, Jill, you want to go on a rock climb?" And I am one for an adventure. So I'm like, sure, sounds fun. Not having any clue. And the only thing he's like, I'll take care of the equipment. You might want to get your own shoes. So I go to REI, I pick out some shoes, and that's all I had. So then we go to the base. And if you know Boulder, Colorado, there's these 3 iconic Flatirons, actually maybe 4, but there's these Flatirons. There's this huge range. It's a foothills that's right by Boulder. They look like the old ironing, Flatiron that we used to use to iron clothes. And so this was the 3rd Flatiron that he was taking me to. We had to hike like an hour to get to the base. And then we get to the base and I look up and it's like 1,000 feet up.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah.
Like, holy cow, what did I get myself into? And at the base, that was my lesson, 10 minutes. Okay, here's the carabiners. Here's what you do. You're going to have to basically, he was the lead. And so he would go and place the ropes and the safety. I don't even know the names of all these things, the things that would stick into the rock and hold the rope so that if he fell, he would fall. And my hold would pull, hold him from falling, and the same thing for me. But he would climb up, and then I had to climb behind him and take these out of the rock and follow his lead. And my first, I went up just a few feet, I fell, scraped my hand, started bleeding. I'm like, oh no. And then I'll tell you what the important thing is. All of us have challenges in our lives, and all of us have these things that we think we can't do. And this was literally a moment, like I told him I could. I made this commitment. I'm going to do this. But inside in my heart, deep, deep down there, I was absolutely terrified. And I think it might have been the most
Which is normal, I would say.
Right. And yeah, you're right. We normalize this. But the thing is, we all have fear. And bravery is not doing those things. It's doing them despite the fear, or it's not even not having fear. Actually, fear, like you said, is a normal response to something really challenging. But what happened on this climb is it profoundly impacted my life in many ways. First of all, it was a metaphor for anything really, really hard. I had to stay so present, looking right in front of me, looking for footholds and grabs. And these are like 1/8 of an inch sometimes to put your foot on, and know that you're on solid rock. And from a faith perspective, that was another piece of it, like knowing there's a greater purpose and meaning, and that I have this solidness in my life, my faith, belief in something greater than me, was part of that foundation. And if I looked back, which again, part of the lesson for life, I would get totally scared because I see thousands of feet down these little trees and houses. If I look too far up, I'm like, oh my goodness, I'll never make it. So I had to every moment just rein in my attention to the present on that rock and be,
Yeah.
it's solid. I can do this. I literally would sing to myself, and the other people probably thought I was crazy because there's other lines of climbers beside me, maybe a few hundred feet away. But I literally, to keep my, stamina
Yeah.
and faith up, I had to sing to myself. But all that to say, when I get to the top, literally 3.5 hours later, sitting on top of that little, crevice at the very top, there was a few other hikers, and then we had to rappel down. I was like, oh my goodness, look what I just did. I cried. I was just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I can't believe I just did that. But what happened is one step at a time, being
Yeah.
present every moment. And that became a metaphor for so many things I had experienced in the past and so many
Mm.
things ahead. And probably the best thing I can tell your listeners, Dr. Gray, is we all have challenges. We either have just gone through something really difficult, we're in the midst of it right now, or it's coming up. And so
Yes.
really,
Yeah.
how do we deal with these really crazy, difficult things in our life? And a lot of it is presence, perspective, belief in something greater. These
Mm.
metaphors are actually really practical for life, right?
Awesome. Awesome. So had you seen that view several times, and did you ever know you would actually like climb up there? Like, had you seen that?
Every day
Yeah.
driving
Yeah.
this boulder, I saw that view, and never in a million years would I have said, oh, I'm going to be on that mountain one day and like climb to the very top. And
One.
now driving by friends
Yeah.
that come to town, or my parents came a few weeks ago, I'm like, Mom and Dad, see that right there?
I
I
did
climbed.
that. Heck yeah. Well, and I think that another cool part of that story is that your friend believed in you. Like he clearly had no concerns. He's like, let's go do this. You can do this. Okay.
Let me tell you about that, because that's so important to our work as doctors. So first of all, Topher's his name. He literally told me later, I looked at my hands. I have pretty big hands for a woman. And I was always really self-conscious of this. Like
Hmm.
in surgery rotations, you get the glove size, and I'm like, yeah, I'm like an 8 or whatever it was.
Hmm.
Like I
Yeah,
had pretty
yeah,
big hands, and I was so self-conscious of that. But he like, I looked at your hands and your arms, and I'm like, she's strong enough to do this. And the importance there is he saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself, and
yeah.
he believed
Mm,
in me. And how it works for us as physicians that I think is relevant is, so often, I'm sure you do this, you have a patient who comes in, they're discouraged. They've been to many other
mhm.
doctors. They have been, told that they're crazy, and they have symptoms and they're not feeling well. And they start to doubt themselves, and they start to be like, am I ever going to get well? And they start to get stuck in that feeling sick every day. And you and I can come in there and be like, you know what? I see the light at the end of this. I see that healing is possible. And I think sometimes it's our belief that they can become something different and become something healthier that actually buoys them up and encourages them. And I think that's one of the biggest things of what we do, is that seeing what is possible in someone
Yes.
else and calling them out to that, and then lifting them up and saying, no,
Mm.
you can do this, right?
Yes, patients need someone who can believe in them, and that's great. Beautiful metaphors. Okay, I'm going to go to another analogy here. In my book, Your Longevity Blueprint, that my listeners have heard lots about, I compare our homes and how they're built to our bodies, and I explain how everyone needs a contractor, aka functional medicine provider, to help them repair and rebuild their health. And so I'm comparing in that book certain aspects of our home to organ systems in our body. And again, we've talked a lot about this on the podcast, but there was a unique parallel within your book because you almost like chapter by chapter went through similar topics as I did. And so I want to be able to break that down and the listeners see it from your perspective a little differently. But before we get there, I want to go back to kind of explain again and hear from your definition what functional medicine is. So, as a functional medicine practitioner, like why is functional medicine important, and really what is your definition of that?
Yeah, so often in traditionally trained medicine, we are told to get it, like as a physician, I'm taught in medical school to get a label, a diagnosis, an
Mhm.
ICD-10 was 9 and before that. And it's this label that describes your set of symptoms. It's very appropriate because it gives us a map of what describes what you're experiencing. And then we know based on that diagnosis and code what to do for treatment.
Mhm.
However, most of the treatments in conventional medicine are drugs and surgery.
Mhm.
Nothing wrong with that. There's a perfectly
Yep.
appropriate place for those interventions, but our toolbox as functional medicine practitioners is way bigger. We have lifestyle, diet, relationships, purpose and meaning, and other kind of biohacking things like ozone or hyperbaric oxygen,
Yes. Yes.
sauna. And so the toolbox number one is bigger because we're looking at all the things that can take your trajectory as you're walking along the road going towards diabetes and reverse that track so you walk the other way, and you can actually
Mhm.
in the model of functional medicine, you don't just get a label and get stuck with that label for life. We say, well, what caused that? What happened? Antecedents, triggers, mediators, things that
Yes.
cause you to walk this way. And then we try to find a way to reverse your trajectory. And we do that through looking at root cause. We look at what led to this condition or outcome or label. And I know you've seen this and I have lived this, but things that are considered irreversible, like Crohn's disease or other autoimmune diseases, you and I, I'm sure, have seen those cases where they are completely reversed. And that's like in conventional medicine, not even considered.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's why we love functional medicine. Yes, and that's why functional medicine is the best for chronic ailments. More, and I know the listeners know this, but just to explain to you, in my book, I more describe conventional medicine as being the fire department. They're here to put out big, bad, ugly fires, and their two tools are that axe and a hose, and that's great for acute care, and that's more what insurance may cover or contribute to. Functional medicine is just different, right? That's more for chronic illness, and like you said, our tools are different. So I'm not going to break down some of these sections or categories or chapters here and get your opinion. So in chapter 1 of my book, Your Longevity Blueprint, I'm comparing the foundation of the home to the gastrointestinal system in the body. And I'm sure you agree that our gut is a foundation of health. And as you shared in your book, you've had several challenges with your gut health. So can you share with us how gut health relates to full body health? And I've asked other guests this, but I want to hear from your perspective, given the diagnosis that you were given.
So real briefly, I grew up on a farm, lots of pesticide chemicals, and I had a weakened kind of immune system, didn't know this. And
Yeah,
so those things led to cancer diagnosis, breast cancer at 25, got chemotherapy, radiation, all kinds of treatment. And that was actually super toxic to my gut. And then 6 months later, now I don't regret that, it saved my life, but the truth
sure.
is super toxic, right? But those drugs created a much more permeable gut lining. And this is our interface to the world. So this is where the gut comes in. Our interface to our environment, chemicals, foods, whatever, is our gut lining, our tube. And the microbiome diversity, the kinds of microbes that are there, the permeability of our gut, the health of the contents of our gut, have a huge impact on our system, because this is the interface that talks through the bloodstream to our immune system. So
Yes.
we have something called neuroendocrinology or neuroimmunology, and all these things where we combine the brain and the gut and the nervous system and the immune system, and they all talk together. So the gut tends to be this like great conductor of business in many parts of the body. And so what happens in your gut doesn't stay in the gut. It affects the immune system. It affects the brain. It affects the cardiovascular system. It affects the liver and the gallbladder.
Which is
So
also something different in functional medicine, is that we're actually seeing those relationships and those interfaces versus conventional medicine, I feel like, is more fragmented. You see this specialist for this and this specialist for this and this specialist for that, where you're literally tying everything together. So I cut you off. So keep going, keep going.
no, perfect, perfect, perfect. It is, it's those silos, right?
Mm,
And I think this is, if you're listening out there and you've been, tossed around from referral to referral, it's great because you can go to specialist rheumatologist and a neurologist and a gastroenterologist, but often they're not really communicating about your health overall. Like it'd be great, like Mayo Clinic has a model where all the docs really, really talk. That's one thing they have really well going for them. But in
yeah,
general, I hear over and over and over again from my patients, like, oh my gosh, well, I saw this doctor, they didn't talk to this doctor. They're both saying two different things. So one of the things with functional medicine is you and I can play quarterback, and we can kind of look at these teams and look at often
yeah.
I'll have them being seen by specialists, but I'm looking at all the details and helping the patient pull together their story. Because when a patient understands what's happening to them and understands their own story, all of a sudden they become empowered to play a part, an active role in that story.
Yes. Okay. So what are some of the top gastrointestinal concerns you see in your patients? So for the listeners, like what symptoms might they be experiencing from a gastrointestinal standpoint or even an autoimmune standpoint? How would someone know if they have an autoimmune disease like what you had?
Yeah, so first things are obvious, like diarrhea, constipation, and people don't know what's regular. They're like, well, I've always gone to the bathroom once a week. Well, that's
Not
not normal.
normal. Yeah.
Right? So having regular bowel movements at least every day, maybe more than once a day, form stools, that's key. Heartburn, reflux, indigestion, diarrhea, gas, bloating, those are not normal. And most people who have IBS, I think it's about 33% of the visits to a primary care office are related to the gut. And they just think that's normal or they have to live with it, but that's not true. And so these kinds of things, but even outside of that, if you have unexplained joint pain, inflammation symptoms, or even brain fog or focus concentration or mood disorders, sleep disorders, we know that those coatings of bacteria, they're called LPS, that sneak outside the gut into the bloodstream are one of the main causes of depression, anxiety, bipolar,
Mm.
schizophrenia, and even insomnia. So if you're having mood disorders, I remember years ago when I first started, I have college kids come in and be like, I'm having depression, or I'm having anxiety or ADD. And part of the workup would be, we need to do a stool test. And they would look at me like I'm
Like
crazy.
what?
Like,
Yeah.
why do you need my stool from this? But that's exactly the reason, because what's happening in your gut has everything to do with your mood and your brain and those outside the gut kind of functions.
So can you tell us, obviously listeners need to read your book to hear the whole story, but can you tell us in short kind of how you were able to heal your colitis? How did you heal your gut?
Yeah, so like I said, the predisposing factors, because I always put together the story, right?
Yes,
Were
yes.
I had celiac, was not diagnosed, didn't know it, and at the age of 14, probably because I was zinc deficient and also hypochlorhydric, which means I didn't produce a lot of
Mhm.
stomach acid. I didn't
Yeah.
really like meat, so I stopped eating meat. I became a vegetarian at
And then
14.
you're amino acid deficient. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
and already zinc
Yeah.
deficient and already, B12 deficient and unbeknownst celiac. So I went on probably the worst diet for me and my genetics. And again, I grew up in a farm, steak and potatoes kind of family. So everybody thought I was crazy. So from 14 till 25, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was on this vegetarian diet, but it was really more like carbitarian. I didn't know how to eat healthy. So I was eating a lot of carbs and a lot of gluten. And I
Mhm.
say that because I didn't know I had celiac, but that gluten was continuing to create inflammation. Then you get chemotherapy, which actually induces leaky gut, dumping contents. And
Mhm.
6 months after the chemo, I was in the hospital for an abscess, and I came out of that surgery, and the doctor said, Jill, you have Crohn's disease. So Crohn's is an autoimmune disease where the body attacks the gut lining. And part of that was because the permeability, the unbeknownst to gluten sensitivity, and then a weakened immune system and all those things I mentioned. So what I had to do is first like figure out what to do and talk to the
Mhm.
gastroenterologist. He's like, Jill, you're going to need lifelong immune modulating drugs. Let's start with steroids, and you're probably going to have part of your colon removed. And as I left the office, I had one question. I was like, can I do anything with diet? I was totally sincere. I just thought, whatever I can do with foods, I'll do
Mhm.
that. He said, Jill, diet has nothing to do with this. And this is where I had to go from my brain of like listening to the doctor, and I'm a
Mhm.
medical student, but I
I
still
was just
did.
going to say, where were you in your journey at this point? You're in medical school.
I was third year medical school. Actually,
Okay.
I just finished third year. I was in my fourth year after like first year rotation of fourth year medical school. So I knew a little bit, but I didn't know enough to be like, oh, he's wrong. But
Right.
intuitively, right? This intuition was like, wait, that can't be right. Diet in the gut has nothing to do with it. So I kind of went on a tangent to prove him wrong, and I did the research, and I ended up finding Elaine Gottschall's specific carbohydrate diet. She wrote a book about it
Mhm.
years and decades
Mhm.
ago. I thought, well, what do I have to lose? I mean, if it doesn't work, no big deal. So I
Right.
went on my diet, I changed my diet, and I knew, Dr. Gray, within 2 weeks, I had no more fevers, I had no more pain, my bowels were starting to form. I was not healed in 2 weeks. It took years. And I'll tell you
You
what
were
I
on the right track. Yeah. Yeah.
but I was like, diet does have
Mhm.
something to do with it, because my symptoms went away. And that was a really big aha, because I realized, wow, food is medicine. It really does have a lot to do with it, even though my doctor said it doesn't. So then what I did is I looked at the microbiome, the inflammation, the leaky gut. I had SIBO and SIFO. I treated those bacterial and fungal overgrowths. Later found out I had immune deficiency, which also contributed to the SIBO and SIFO. I think I maybe at one point had Giardia. Yeah, I did, because I had gone to Honduras. And so multiple infections in the gut.
Yeah.
First treat, it's kind of like the 5R program. You treat the infections. And then over the years, I've just restored the integrity of that gut lining through butyric acid and non-inflammatory foods and glutamine and spore probiotics. So I just added those things in. And even today, I live what I preach. I eat a really clean anti-inflammatory diet. I take spore probiotics and do all the things. And I've maintained completely free of Crohn's ever since, maybe a few years after my diagnosis.
Does your doctor know? I always wonder, obviously that was years and years and years ago, but my patients who get better, part of me wants them to go back to their doctor to say, look, proof this worked, right? That's, yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny. Like, I don't even remember now, like what his name
Who,
was. I was in
he's
medical school.
probably
So
not even in practice
I
anymore.
know someday he'll hear some, maybe, or
Maybe he already
I
has.
just
Yeah.
send a copy of my book to him.
Yes, you should. You should. Okay, moving right along. In chapter 8 of my book, I'm comparing the protective roof of our home to the immune system in the body, kind of
Yeah.
echoing off what you're already saying here. And that's titled Maintaining Roof Integrity, Treating Underlying Infections, and Strengthening Your Immune System. So this is a chapter I get into biotoxin illness, which you've also had, which I want to get to. But first, you've already shared so much of your incredible story. I want to go back to your breast cancer story because I was shocked to hear how young you were when you were diagnosed. So can you expand a little bit on that? That shocking diagnosis and then kind of how you recovered from that.
Yeah. So 25 years old. And again, now it's like, just like, really? That's crazy. And to put it in perspective, now since then, you and I have both heard of people in their 20s and even like 16 or 18.
Sadly, yep.
So sad. But at that moment, 2001, at Loyola in Chicago, where I was diagnosed, I was the youngest they'd ever, like I made a statistic at Loyola because I was the youngest they'd ever diagnosed.
Yeah.
And I remember the tumor board, which was a group of oncologists and doctors that met for these interesting cases. Well, I was the interesting case. So I was on the tumor board meeting of what do you do with Dr. Jill? I wasn't Dr. Jill at the time, I was just Jill. And so what do we do? And they were very aggressive because of my age. And so
Yeah.
even though the stage wasn't super advanced, the characteristics of the cancer cells were as aggressive as you could possibly get. It was ER/PR negative, HER2 positive, and incredibly high grade, like as bad as you can get. So they
Mm,
gave me everything in their arsenal, which was 3-drug chemotherapy and radiation and multiple
wow.
surgeries. So that's the treatment. But back to, okay, then you and I say, well, why did this happen? Well,
Right.
we know that cancer cells, the damaging of DNA that starts to go into proliferation can happen even decades before the tumor. So you take 25, you go back, 10 or 5 or whatever. I believe there was a couple things. I believe my mother had a toxic load. She never really complained, but she had chronic migraines, chronic fatigue, thyroiditis.
Sure.
And of course, I grew up on a farm, and some of the farm chemicals, organophosphates, and especially one called atrazine.
Mm-hmm.
Atrazine is a known endocrine disruptor. It acts like hormone on the body. And so our cells, like our breast cells and in men, prostate cells or endometrium, can have these triggers that are a chemical that the body thinks is a hormone. And so starts to trigger that growth and division. I remember literally 10 or 12 years after my diagnosis, I was reading and understanding how toxic atrazine was. And I called my dad and I said, Dad, this is horrible. When was it banned in the US? And he's like, no, Jill, it's still being used. And it just so happened the same year I was diagnosed, 2001, the European Union banned the use of atrazine, like it should, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we still today, 20 plus years later, are using atrazine in Illinois. And I remember looking at the map of usage of atrazine, and the hottest, brightest spot in the whole US was right where I grew up, right in central Illinois, was like bright red. And I
And
had this.
for the listeners in Iowa, a lot of my listeners are in Iowa. We're bright red also. We're right there. We're right up there with Illinois, but yeah,
So
continue.
corn and soybean,
Yeah.
Iowa
Yeah.
and Illinois, it's like
Yep.
still used today.
Yep.
So the good news is because of my cancer diagnosis and the understanding of how chemicals were affecting human health and people like myself. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but my sister at 28 was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. So 2
Mm.
girls, same farm, same environment, similar genetics, both endocrine related cancers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Turns out there was an environmental impact. But all that to say, my family, because of that, has gone completely non-GMO on all the crops, the corn and soy.
Yay. Yep.
Yes. And part of it's organic, which is really hard to do with central
Mm-hmm.
Illinois corn and
Takes
soybeans.
time too. Yep. 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 So what are some of the other top toxins our listeners should be avoiding? So
Yeah.
obviously we should be eating organic, non-GMO food, trying to avoid the atrazine, the pesticides, herbicides, whatnot. But what are some other toxins you talk about in the book that listeners could be and should be avoiding?
Yeah, so we have endotoxins and exotoxins. Exotoxins are those outside of us, which is most of our conversation here. And those would be things like parabens. Those are plastic softeners and things, and phthalates. Those two are very common in makeup, bath and body products, hand sanitizers, different things that we use day to day. So where I would start and where I started once I found out that, chemicals could have affected my breast cancer,
Mhm.
I went to Environmental Working Group, which is
Yep.
ewg.org. It's a nonprofit that lists some of the top toxins, and you can look up their beauty database on beauty products and things and see what your rating is for what you're using. I will just say the commercial products, I won't mention brands, are pretty toxic. So you really have to think about the kinds of off brands. Now they're becoming more common. So you can go to Sephora or any of those places and get some non-toxic brands, but you really want to look at what's in the things you're putting on your skin. And that's what I started with. So sunscreen, makeup, lotions, even bubble bath, things that are happening. I'll just give a personal opinion. I love Epsom salt baths, take one almost every night. Plain Epsom salt's really great and no toxins. It's really good for detox.
No fragrance. Yeah, no.
But a lot
Yeah.
of the packages, I would even get some of these with like a lavender fragrance. And I looked at it's like it's paraben based. It's a fragrance that's artificial. And I tested on my urinary toxins and saw those phthalates up. And I'm like, where am I getting that? It was my bath because I was using salt that had fragrances. So be
Yeah.
sure to do things like that. So bath and body products, air scent, like the plug-in air fresheners and things, those are VOCs, volatile organic compounds, formaldehydes. and different things. And those go right into our lungs and get absorbed immediately because they're so small. And then things like hydrocarbons, like from charred broiled meats or blackened, salmon or swordfish, those are really harmful and carcinogenic. PFAs, so polyfluorinated compounds, is like your Teflon Gore-Tex. It's all the waterproofing for camping and hiking and outdoors, but it's also a lot of the coatings of our pans
And
even
air
if you,
fryers, I was very sad to hear. Yes.
yep. And takeout. How many of us nowadays get takeout? Even good, clean food, those containers they put takeout in are made to not leak oils, and they're coated with PFAOs. And the reason this is important is like these are forever chemicals. So they're going to be, scientists can't even calculate the half-life. And recently in Colorado, last summer, they tested water supplies. 100% of the water tested had PFAOs above the legal limits in them, which means right now, this moment, there's an issue, and it's only going to get worse. And
What
you
are they going to
can,
do about that? What is the solution? How do you
yeah.
filter that out? I don't.
So a good carbon filter will filter about 80 to 90%, and a reverse osmosis is the best. So if in your house, you need to have clean air, clean water, clean.
Yes.
This is one of those things I talk all the time, because we can have all the supplements and expensive protocols in the world, but everybody has access to do simple things for clean air, clean water, clean food. Clean water includes having a filter, either countertop, fridge filter, or ideally a whole house filter, or your water that you drink and bathe in and cook with.
Absolutely. Okay. What about EMFs? Any
Yeah.
tips for reducing EMFs as
Yes.
another toxin in this category?
Oh, huge. And people don't think about this, like, oh, I'm fine because you don't feel it. Well, more people, first of all, we have more and more and more of EMFs in our environment. So the router in your house, a household router. And there was a study that showed household router increased, say there was a little bit of mold in your house. If it's unprotected, that mold will increase the production of mycotoxins, which cause illness by 600% in the presence of EMFs. So it might also be, I've seen people with maybe sinus colonization, they feel worse in EMFs, not because their body's being bothered, it's because the mold in their body.
Exacerbating the mold. Yep.
Yeah. So EMFs are real common. You can get, if you ever want to check your house, usually a building biologist is someone who has a degree that can come in and check. I just took it to work, but normally right here beside me, I have an EMF meter that I bought online for $200 or $300, where I can actually check different parts of my house. For example, my Sonos speaker system, love it. I love to stream music in my house and my work, but my Sonos speakers put off an astronomical amount of radiation. And I've been thinking lately, I need to wire this or change it. Same with your Wi-Fi, and same with if you have cordless phones, which most of us don't anymore. And of course, cellular phones, you need to have protected devices on your cellular phones. I have a little tiny device right here called an Aries Tech that is one of those things that will protect EMFs. And there's many, many others out there, but you need to think about protection. I also have another device here. I'll show you real quick because it's fun. It's like, I call it the alien, but this is another device you can have in your house that protects from EMFs.
I haven't seen that one. Yeah, I have a safe sleep case on my phone, and we shut off our Wi-Fi every night. But yeah, I mean, it's hard, especially when you're working, unless things are, what do you want to call it? Like you were connected to the wall. What do you call that when it's grounded or whatever?
Wired, yeah,
Wired,
yeah.
yes. Unless it's wired, everything is wireless these days.
It is.
Let's go back to biotoxins, also just still on this topic of toxins, right? So maybe here you could share how you were unfortunately, sadly exposed to mold, and then what additional, after everything else you'd been through, what additional impact this had on your health.
Yeah, so cancer 25, Crohn's at 26, got through those, went on to move to Colorado, started a practice. I was running, hiking, doing really well in my late 30s. And 2013, there was a massive flood. Sadly, as you guys have watched the news all over now, there's floods. It's been more and more fires
We've
and
had
floods.
several here in Iowa. Yep.
Friend in Vermont, and you name many of them.
Yep.
But all I can say, we had a massive flood early on in Boulder and survived it, thought everything was great. But in my office building, which was probably having an issue before, but the water damage exacerbated it. And that following year, I started to have really severe fatigue, exhaustion, red eyes, brain fog, trouble remembering names and words, word finding issues, and on and on and on. And I was like, something is not right. I was just going downhill, and ended up, I did an inspection in the basement, found bulk Stachybotrys, which is a really nasty black mold. And then I did testing for my urine to see if that would match the kind of toxins that I was excreting in my urine, trichocythines, which are mycotoxins made by that black mold Stachybotrys. So I knew there was an issue. And literally the day that I got the test back, it was after Christmas, right after Christmas on 2014. I never again set foot in my office. I literally walked away, just took patient records.
You knew too much. You're like, I'm out.
Yeah. And now I know not everybody has to do that or even can do that. But I had a
Yeah.
landlord that wasn't willing to
Mhm.
fix it. So it wasn't a thing where I could remediate. I had no choice but to walk away. And it was one of the hardest things in my life because not only was I walking away from like 20 years of medical school textbooks, my office, like everything in there, I walked away. I started over, except for patient records. Everything else was starting over. But the bigger thing was my health was so valuable. I realized it was worth walking away. The other thing about it was in that time when you're in mold, you're overwhelmed, your insight is impaired sometimes, you're exhausted. So it was also hard to do it while I'm super toxic from mold. But what ended up is what happens in a lot of my life is I had to really learn how to heal myself. And it started with
Mhm.
how I heal myself before I could heal anyone else. And so I really learned deep dive into detox from mold and how you need to focus on liver, gallbladder function, your bowel function, binders, and we can certainly talk about any of that. But I took, the next 18 to 24 months to really heal from mold.
I want to go there, but let's rewind just a little bit for the listeners. How would they know they may have been exposed? Like, can we list some other symptoms? I use a symptom questionnaire with my patients, but what are some other cues to listeners that mold may be a problem for them?
Yeah, so the number one thing with mold is cognition. So it could be impaired memory. In fact, Dr. Dale Bredesen's research, he says 1 in 3 early onset dementia are related to mold. So
Wow, I
certainly
didn't know
like
that.
50,
Yeah,
60 or
I want to
early
take his
onset.
program. That's on my to-do list
Oh,
this
it's
year. Yeah,
amazing,
yeah.
amazing. And so he's seen that, and he's not the mold expert. He just sees it in his work with
Mhm.
dementia. Certainly older people too, but like early onset dementia, it very common. So if you're starting to have brain cognition issues, memory, focus, concentration, number one symptom. Number two, mast cell activation, which has been a real hot topic.
Mhm.
Mold is a huge trigger to mast cells. So anything related to that, which could be rashes, irritation, congestion in sinuses, trouble breathing, burning in the lungs, chronic cough with no resolution. And then things like leaky gut. So all of a sudden you're sensitive to way more foods. You can't tolerate other foods, or you're getting rashes after you eat, or you're getting swollen lips, or you're becoming more allergic to things and more sensitive to your environment. Mast cells can also cause heart palpitations
Mhm.
or neurological things like numbness and tingling, weakness, and dizziness, lightheadedness. There's so many different things in different systems. Even new onset autoimmunity can be related to mold.
Yikes, yikes, yikes. Okay, so let's talk about how we can detox from that. Although I will say before we get to that, number one piece of advice, which obviously you heeded yourself, is to remove yourself from the exposure, right? You have to get away from the exposure in order to truly heal. So after you've removed yourself from the exposure, and I'm going to bring on this season also in the podcast more home remediators and just tips on how to build a non-toxic home. And we're going to get there, listeners, because that I think is sometimes a hard part too, especially in Iowa, because we don't have building biologists here. We don't have a lot of access to, I'll say, specialists that some of the other more progressive states do, but we'll get there. So at least while I have you here today, let's more or less move on to how you do detox from mold. So previously you said supporting the kidney and liver, and I know you created a specific binder product with Quicksilver Scientific that we carry here, that black box. So can you kind of go into some of those steps as far as detoxing from mold?
Yeah, and I want to just emphasize just what you said is if you are experiencing mold and you know there's mold in your home, you don't necessarily have to walk away from everything like I did, but you have to fix the problem. So you either
Mm-hmm.
have to remediate, and let's talk that real quickly, because
Sure.
even if you use a regular remediator, you can go and you tear out the wall and you need to, have margins and all the right things. You need to contain that space so it doesn't blow out mold toxins and fragments all over the house. But the bigger thing is, say you remediate correctly and you've gotten rid of the mold in your house. Before you ever found that mold, it was secreting mycotoxins. And I equate this like to a fire, like the spores in the mold are like a fire creating smoke. Well, that smoke damage to your home is still there after you remove the fire, right? So part of people really getting well and part of unsuccessful or failed remediations is not that they didn't remove everything appropriately, but often it's because the mycotoxins got distributed in your books and your bedding and your furniture.
Mm-hmm.
So you really need to fog and then usually clean. We call it a small particulate clean. And this is something that, I mean, you can have a specialist do it. It's very expensive, but you can even do it yourself, hire a cleaners. They just need to be very detailed and wipe down and clean everything in your home and maybe get rid of some of the porous products. So that
Right.
makes successful remediation. Then your body, what do you do with this? Because when you inhale mycotoxins or mold into your body, you can either become colonized in the sinuses or the gut, but not everybody's colonized. Sometimes you just get exposure and immune system goes haywire. But whatever it is, you need to get those toxins out of your tissues into the bloodstream where the liver and the kidney and the skin and the lungs can filter. So we focus a lot on the liver gallbladder pathway because this is a real easy way to address this. And what you want to do is increase production of glutathione. You either take it, you can do it IV, you can do it liposomal, and then that will cause the liver to dump the toxins into the bile and it's stored in the gallbladder, and then it secretes it into the gut. And the enterohepatic circulation of bile is very efficient, about 95% so. So you need to interrupt that and actually do something to grab that bile and escort it out through the stool. And that's where binders can come in handy. And there's a
Yes.
lot of research on clay, charcoal, glycomannan, chlorella, and even probiotics like Saccharomyces or N-acetylcysteine, which is not a probiotic. But anything in those realms can bind those toxins. There's also prescription binders like cholestyramine and Welchol, and these things will help escort those out of your body. Typically, when we do that, liver support, glutathione, other things would be N-acetylcysteine, lipoic acid, milk thistle, vitamin C, selenium, and of course, many, many other things. But those are just some of the basics for liver. And then pulling it out with binders. And then things that really enhance secretion from the tissues is infrared sauna,
Yes.
Epsom salt baths, like I mentioned, even coffee enemas, which us medical people don't talk about a lot, but that can really stimulate the liver to produce more glutathione.
Well said. You're just going. You're just rattling it all off. That's good. That's good. I want to also kind of differentiate mold from Lyme because there can be some overlap in symptoms. And living in Iowa, we do have a lot of patients who have Lyme disease that we're finding. So what are some cues you're listening to with your patients as far as, and many patients, to be clear, have Lyme and mold illness,
Yes.
but what are some of the cues or clues you're hearing from your patients that are kind of leading you down the direction of, yep, we need to explore Lyme versus mold?
Okay, love this. So first thing I want to do is frame almost all chronic complex illness as two buckets. It's toxic load plus infectious burden. And they play together because if you have old Epstein-Barr that you got mono when you were 19, or you had chickenpox at 5, or you got bit by a tick at 24 and you have Lyme, those things can be dormant and not bothering you. And you might feel great. You might test positive, but you're actually feeling fine. But what happens is that, so that would be infectious burden. You have some things that probably we've all been exposed to, and you have a different, conglomerate than the other person. But then when you get in a toxic environment, so whether it's parabens, phthalates, VOCs, toxic smoke from wildfires, or mold, which is very common, this weakens immune system, allowing these old dormant infections to start to pop up and create havoc and symptoms. And the
Well
reason
said. Yes, well said. Yeah.
and the reason that's important is because when you understand that mold is always first if there is a mold issue, because sometimes you get out of the mold, you detox the body, you restore immunity to normal, and you don't even have to be aggressively treating Lyme. So the first thing is always, if they do present with Lyme, do they have a toxic environment? Because even before you want to detox or treat the Lyme, you want to start with that environment and start to at least do a little bit of detox.
Sure.
You'll be more successful. And those interplay, understanding that is like, well, why do I have both? Well, both because often you get in the moldy environment, weaken immune system, and Lyme starts to pop up. But then your question was, how do you differentiate? How do I know
Yeah.
which way to go? So the number 1 and 2 things with Lyme are going to be chronic pain of some type, typically joint, and it's migratory. So one day it's shoulder, one day it's the knee, next week it's your back. And people can have chronic neck and back issues, even with findings on MRI or x-rays that also have Lyme, because typically Lyme will go to the places of your weakest link. So if you have chronic neck pain, it might be exacerbated by the Lyme, or you have chronic low back pain. That's a real issue, but it could be made worse by the Lyme. So I've seen a lot of people was like, oh, well, I just have a back issue, but it's actually Lyme creating a lot more pain and inflammation, or an old knee injury, because it'll go to those places. And then fatigue. Now, mold can absolutely cause fatigue. It's one of the number 1 symptoms there too. But if that pain and fatigue, I feel like that is a much more classic presentation of Lyme, whereas mold is the cognitive dysfunction, the brain fog, the inflammation, the autoimmunity. And both mold and Lyme can cause autoimmunity. So order of operations is limbic system first, which means get rid of the trauma if at all possible, because these things are traumatic. To start to do some work on
That was my
healing.
next question. You're getting ahead of me. No, no,
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Go there. Go there. Go there. Yeah.
We'll go back to that. So we'll come back right back to that. But you have to start there, and you have to start something with that limbic, because we know, I did the research in my book, and basically a chemical exposure through the nose stimulates hypothalamic pituitary axis to trigger amygdala, fight or flight. So even if you're like, I'm fine, I'm in mold again, but I'm gonna be okay, you still get a trigger of a fight or flight response. So that's number 1. Number 2, if you have mast cells involved, they have to be calmed down, or you won't get anywhere with treatment. And then number 3 is the toxin and the mold and the toxic load. Number 4 or 5 is the infection. So Lyme ends up being down the road a little bit. Now you can do these simultaneously, but you have to start somewhere. So I always start in that order.
Well said. All right. So I agree with all of that. And then chapter 5 of my book is more about all of this, about tackling the laundry, AKA detoxing the body. And this is just something that everybody needs to hear. And I hope all functional medicine practitioners are really addressing. Now, something I did not dive into in the first edition of my book back in 2017 was trauma, which is also a toxin. I just didn't know a lot about it back then. But I've since had several guests come on the show that have talked about the adverse childhood event score, who have shared their personal transformations, who have gone through a lot of unfortunate childhood trauma. And I so appreciate them sharing their stories and you sharing some of your story in your book as well. And trauma is something that's obviously personal, so it's hard to like talk about on the podcast. But you've been forward in your book, of course, talking a little bit about this. So can we go there? Can you, I guess you've already brought to the listeners awareness how important trauma is, and we can get into limbic system retraining, but when did you recognize trauma was a part of your story? And then I guess we'll get into the work you did again to heal from that.
I love that you bring this up, and you're right. Even 5, 10 years ago, even functional medicine, we weren't talking about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the next phase of functional medicine is going to be including this in our treatment.
Yes.
It's so powerful. For me personally, I didn't know I had trauma. I wasn't even thinking about that. And I always say I lived from the neck up before 40. So I was very analytical. I was all up here in my head. And it's funny because that can actually be a trauma response where we use our analytical mind to look at a situation we don't feel. So we're kind of dissociating from the feeling about a trauma or a difficult event. Even my breast cancer, I look back and I was completely dissociated from the feeling. I was like, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to be, tough. And I got through it. But as I've dealt with trauma, I actually started feeling back to that 25-year-old and having such deep compassion. I'm like, oh, sweetheart, you weren't very kind to yourself. You were just like right back at the rotations right after surgery and not really feeling, not allowing yourself to feel.
Right.
Now, dissociation is a beautiful coping mechanism. It's not always bad, because when we dissociate, we can deal with, it's one of the reasons why you and I going through medical training can deal with an emergency in the ER. We can just dissociate from that, seeing someone who's got a limb that's, torn or, something really awful. I went through the burn unit at Loyola. It was horrific.
It was horrible. Yeah, it was my least favorite rotation.
Yeah. And seeing that, you can't, if you have that deep, deep compassion, you're in your body, you're
Yeah.
like, oh, this is horrible. I can't, so you have to dissociate to some
Mhm.
extent to be a good objective physician, but we went to such a degree. And by doing that, then I don't think about the trauma or any of that. But after 40, after I went through divorce, that kind of woke me up to what piece trauma had to do with my healing. I really, really dove deep. I did EMDR, NLP, I did a different biohacking things. I did brain spotting. I did family systems therapy. You name a type of somatic based therapy, I've probably done it. And all of those things work together to allow me to become more associated with my body and to become more associated, because our body, if you're out there listening and you're sick or you're not feeling well, it gives us clues. And if we clue into what those are, then we start to associate and be able to make good decisions based on, oh, my body's telling me this is a bad environment or a wrong relationship or a toxic mold in my house or whatever. And as we start to associate, we can become more attuned to those signals that our body gives us and start to make better choices. And by dealing with that old trauma, we can really become more embodied is the word. And I'm certainly not the expert, but I've lived it. And I live a much more embodied way. And what that brings to my practice now is, as I listen to patients, I'm hearing them on multiple levels. I'm hearing them here with my mind and making decisions, but I'm also hearing them with my heart. And often there's an intuitive sense of a direction to go, and we prove it with the labs or the science, but I'm listening much more with my heart. But I couldn't have done that if I was living from my neck up here in my head before.
So this is a hard question, but where do you start? Like I now in the last few years have been more screening and listening, right, for that history, screening for my patients' history of trauma and listening for that too. But again, in Iowa, the part I find more difficult is like even finding trauma therapists. Like there just aren't many around here to even refer to. So like where do you start? I know you mentioned tons of tools that you utilize. Do you have just a favorite, or
Yeah,
it's
I
such
do
a
have a
complex
few.
topic why I'm asking you to simplify, but
You got it. And this
yeah.
is, I have no association, but as for so patients, there's a bunch of things that people can do online with themselves. And it's
Yes.
not perfect, but for
Yeah.
someone like you said, is maybe in
Yeah.
a different country or in Iowa where there's no somatic practitioners.
Yeah.
The ones that have been around forever are the Annie Hopper's course
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
Gupta's course,
Yep.
NRS and those. But
Yep.
one I've come across that patients are loving, and again, no association, it's called Primal Trust.
I was going to ask you about that one. I just heard about that this week. Yep.
Yeah,
From
love
Bethel
it.
Harris. She told me. Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
And
Wonderful.
patients are really giving me good feedback. Again, I have no association, but I've heard really good things about that.
I was just on their website. Wonderful. Okay, so let's also talk about just ways to reduce stress in general. So, trauma aside, what are some tips you have for reducing stress?
Yeah. Back to how we started on the mountain, there's a lesson there that's so important. Usually our stress comes from worrying about the past, what we did, how we appeared, what happened, whatever. Or looking and projecting the future and like, what if I can't make enough money? What if I can't pay my mortgage? What if someone I love dies? What if I lose my beloved in, relationship, or any number of things? What if my child gets hurt? All these things that go through our mind. Those are future and past related, and we can't control them. And we know from Hans Selye's work that the acronym NUTS describes the things that cause stress. So novelty, U is unpredictability, T is threat to ego or threat to health, and S is sense of control. So if we are something new that we don't know what to do with, it's unpredictable, it's threatening to our health, like COVID pandemic was for all of us, or sense of control, those things are all going to be threatening. They're going to raise cortisol and they're going to be traumatic. So what we want to do is come back to the present, because right now in this moment,
Yes.
control over our conversation and how I'm showing up, and we have control in the moment of what we say or do or how we react. So that's number one, is staying present and pulling ourselves back when our mind goes this way or that way, pulling ourselves back to the present. And then number two is reframing suffering. We're all going to have it. It is, we like to get insurance policies and all kinds of things to protect ourselves, right, from a horrible event or a loss of, nothing wrong with that. But the truth is we don't have control. We think we do. And so if we expect that we are going to suffer and have difficulties, we don't like it, we take pain medicines, we do all these things to avoid suffering. But if we actually embrace suffering and say, what is this here to teach me? And granted, I don't want you or me or anyone else to have to suffer, but it is inevitable. But if we reframe that and say, okay, I'm going to suffer. I hope not soon, and I hope not long. And then we reframe it as, while we're there, what is this thing here to teach me? What is this thing here to change my soul? And I've gone through so many things that have been incredibly difficult. But as I look back now, I understand, oh, that breast cancer was my first and best medical training about how to be a doctor. And it gave me such a deep compassion and understanding that I would never have. And it turned into a gift. At the time, I hated it. So as we reframe suffering, it really changes our stress, because instead of being shocked by it, we're like, oh, suffering, here you are again. Darn it. I really don't like that you're here, but let's get through this as quick as possible and learn in it. And it doesn't become a stressor because we know it's coming and we know how to deal with it.
Love that. I was next going to ask you about, you talk about in your book getting into that flow state, and I was going to ask like exactly what that means. And I feel like you've already kind of answered a little bit of that with your past response, but what do you mean by that flow state in your book?
Yeah, this is so important because this is the natural high. So if you know how to get into flow, you will never need drugs or any substance to create an altered state of consciousness, because you can just do it with natural things. So flow is that optimal state of, number one, 500% increase in performance. So if you want to write a book or do a new career or teach your child to do something, or you name a thing you want to do, you're going to be way more effective at it if you're in flow. So what is flow? Flow is that time, if you all have a time you remember it, maybe it was playing a musical instrument where you got lost for 3 hours creating a new song, and all of a sudden 3 hours passed.
Yeah.
And time shortens and all of a sudden it's 3-4 hours later, or it expands to where it feels longer or shorter. You're just not in touch with time. There's usually a sense of euphoria and happiness and joy with what you're doing. And again, it could be a creative pursuit like painting or art or being in nature or creating music or writing, or it can be an athletic thing like big wave surfing or climbing mountains or skiing. So it can be anything in there. And there's a challenge skill ratio where you are about 4% above what you think you can do. So it's just like the rock climbing for me, maybe that was 40% above.
Way more than 4%.
Yeah, it's this thing where you feel like, gosh, this is harder than I think I can do. But if it's too challenging, you won't finish. So you want just a little bit more challenging than you can think. And that'll keep your interest engaged and you won't be bored, but it'll also challenge you to develop new skills. And the physiological thing that happens is you have an optimal state of serotonin, dopamine, anandamide, and oxytocin. So all of the neurotransmitters come together to actually literally give you a natural high. So people love this state. When you've been in it before, you want to go back to it. And as I think about these, even a jazz musician improvise, they can be there hours just making this music. So wherever you are, whatever you've done, you probably can think of, oh yeah, I think I was in flow when. And so if we pursue getting into flow, and there's flow triggers, like how we do things, and even things like caffeine can take us into flow sometimes more easily. But the more you have flow in your life, the more happy you will be and the more productive you'll be.
Love it, love it. Okay, I also want to, I'm going kind of going off tangent, but you also talk about being curious in your book and how important it is to be curious. Can you expand on that?
I loved when I saw the research on curiosity, and it's one of the most closely related to genius, because and you see this in all of our inventors and people that were like, oh my gosh, Albert Einstein was a genius, right? Or whatever people that we.
Yeah, yeah,
The reason those, and I just got done talking to Dan Buettner of the Blue Zones today, a huge hero of mine, and he
yeah,
described how he was with National. He was an explorer, and he's out there exploring, different things, and all of a sudden he started to see these patterns. And I said, oh, you were curious. And so as
yes,
I heard his story, it was literally curiosity that allowed him to get a whole group of researchers together to find what makes people live longer. And now, of course, he's got the blue zones and all this information for us to help us. But it was curiosity. So you'll see this, and even as you and I, as physicians, curiosity is often what drives new discoveries.
hmm,
So being curious is one of those things that's kind of magic sauce to your life, because often you find things you would have never found. You go deeper and explore. And even in our lives of like what we think is possible for us, for our life, for our healing, when we say, what else is possible? Is there anything else I'm missing? And we start to ask questions, our subconscious literally goes to work at solving that for us. I've had this thing I've done for years is right before I go to sleep, if I have a problem in my life, I'll often pray and then I'll journal about it and kind of put down, okay, this is the situation, and then I'll just sleep. But during my sleep time, my mind will kind of chew on that. And there's been so many times where either I wake up at 2 a.m., oh my goodness, I never thought about that. That's the answer. Or I'll wake up in the morning or the next day and I'll have a solution. And the reason for that is I give my subconscious kind of a question or a
yeah.
problem at the time, and then it chews on it. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, you have this aha about the answer. And we all have that ability.
I never heard that. That's great advice. Lots of good advice here. We're wrapping up the show, but I have a few more questions for you. So I love again how you weave your story through the book, but also you advise the reader just simple take homes along the way. So you do make the complex more simple. And one page that I really liked was the page on important lab tests you think everyone should have run by the time they're 30. So can you share with our listeners who might be maybe new to functional medicine, maybe not because they've listened to this podcast, but what are some of those labs that they should request their provider run
Yeah, so I'm going to give you just a few, but there's like a lot and a lot of details. So if
in the
you
book?
want
Yeah,
more
yep.
info, on my website and my blog, it's just jillcarnahan.com blog. You can look these up and actually read about all of them because you might want more, or the book, they're in there too. But basic metabolic profile, CBC, all that stuff most doctors are doing.
Yep.
But I advise going deeper to look at iron levels, to look at autoimmune markers like ANA or anti-gliadin antibodies, to look at your hormones. Your first of all, thyroid would be TSH, free T3, free T4, thyroid antibodies, reverse T3, hormones, estradiol, progesterone, DHEAS, testosterone free and total, cortisol in the morning. That's like a good hormone
Yep.
panel. You can also do DHT, dihydroxytestosterone, if you're having hair loss. And really look at that hormones. Well, cortisol is important. And I often advise doing a 4-point cortisol test through the day,
Mhm.
basically map your adrenal function. And those are kind of your hormones. We talk about autoimmunity and making sure you don't have celiac. You can check anti-gliadin antibodies and actual TTG, IgA, and IgG, which are the markers in our gut if there's permeability based on gluten. And it can actually predict celiac disease if they're positive. And then things like homocysteine, which show our methylation and our B vitamin status, uric acid, super important for inflammation, metabolic health, CRP and ESR are inflammatory markers. And most of docs aren't doing these as a routine panel, but the more we look at this, the more we can prevent chronic disease.
Love it, love it. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience before we get to, I do want to ask listeners where they can find you, but is there anything else that you wanted to mention that kind of is highlighted in your book that we didn't get to? Are leaving
Yeah,
any strong points out?
no, you have been amazing. But the one thing I leave people with, we've kind of touched on this, is that, I'm not unique. And my biggest goal in writing my story wasn't to say, oh my gosh, Jill overcame all these things. Not at all. What it was to show you out there listening that this is possible for you too, to just kind of give you a glimpse of actually the day to day. And in there, I talk about my pain and my struggles and when I cried and when I was like, oh, I can't do this anymore. The reality of our humanity is common, and I am no different than anyone else. But what I want to do in the book and what I want to tell you today is that you too can have unexpected miracles, which is these things that we think maybe aren't possible, but they really are. And it's all to do with our mindset, getting curious, finding a functional medicine practitioner or learning what you can online and being an advocate for yourself and your health.
Amen. Okay, Dr. Carnahan, where can listeners find you?
Yeah, so my website, jillcarnahan.com, has everything, podcasts, blogs, link to the book, everything you might need. And be sure and go to my Instagram because I have lots of fun,
Yeah,
silly
you do.
there.
Yep, yep.
It's just Dr. Jill Carnahan on Instagram as well.
And you're offering our listeners a free chapter in your book. So tell us where they can locate that.
Yes. So if you're like, oh, I maybe want to get this, I want to know more. The story we talk about climbing, that's chapter 1. It's free. Just go to readunexpected.com/free chapter. And I'm sure you'll put the link, but readunexpected.com/free chapter. Grab chapter 1 and listen to how I overcame the 3rd flat iron. It's all free.
And then you'll want to get the book. All right. So what is your absolute top longevity tip? You've given us so many, but if you had to narrow it down to one, what is your top longevity tip?
That's easy and it's very boring. It's sleep. The one thing I remember years ago, before I knew anything about this, health or went into functional medicine, and at the girls' slumber party in 8th grade, I was the one who was conked out at like 10 p.m. and they'd like freeze my bra and do all kinds of terrible things while I was sleeping. But even back then, I was like, if I came home without sleep, I would usually get sick. And my mother was like, "You're never
Yeah.
going to a slumber party again."
Yeah.
So way, way back then, I was like, I must be an alien, but I need sleep and I know it's important. And I remember again, like probably in high school, I was like, sleep is critical. And it's always been like the number one foundation of what I seek is great sleep, because I can handle a lot if I've had a good night's sleep.
That's the most common answer. And it's so true.
Wow.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, this was incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I have to tell you, I think we have a lot in common in that both of our mothers were our prayer warriors. I know you mentioned in Unexpected that you said something like you heard that prayers on our behalf are like tears in a bottle that God collects. And I had never heard that. And I thought that was beautiful. So, thank you for sharing in your book to never give up and that message to our audience today, and that each challenge can give us that opportunity to become stronger and resilient. So I hope each of our listeners picks up a copy of your beautiful book. And I hope one day to have a fraction of the impact on the world that you have had. So again, thank you for coming on the show, sharing your struggles, and for encouraging us to trust our intuition, transform that toxicity. You say so many beautiful things in your book, like embrace uncertainty, choose unconditional love, and get into that flow state. I would say that this was unexpected, but actually this interview was as expected. It was amazing. So you're, you're a rock star pioneer in the field of functional medicine and someone I've looked up to again for years. So it was an honor having you on the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And thank you for all the beautiful work you put into the world as well.